we are imprisoned by our emotions. We feel some way, we act some way. But the mindset is, oh, I can't help it. That's just the way I feel. Welcome back to another episode. I am your host, Dr. Maisha. And as always, I am very grateful to be able to be with you here on another episode. Today, we're talking about emotional maturity and what's behind that. And I know this word it's out there. It's being used a lot on social media. You might see it a lot. And I think it's important because what we are seeing in communication and between people is a lack of emotional maturity or a lack of emotional intelligence. And I talk a lot about emotional intelligence on this podcast. I do a lot of workshops with organizations. I talk about it on stage oftentimes when I talk about how we move into a resilient space. And there's a relationship. There's a relationship between emotional and maturity and our emotional intelligence, our reconnection to our innate emotional intelligence. And notice that's when I talk about emotional intelligence, that is the way I talk about it. When we are born with this innate sense of how being connected to our emotions. And even though we as babies don't necessarily express them in words, when we feel them, we express them in ways that communicate what we need. And so as we grow up, we're conditioned out of that. The relationship between emotional maturity and emotional intelligence is that when we are separated from our innate emotional intelligence, it impacts our ability to respond and communicate in a way that is emotionally mature. And so I want to talk about what is behind that emotional maturity, the three phases that we go to as we're conditioned out of that connection with our emotional intelligence, and as we are moving back towards that reconnection and that emotional maturity. And just to make sure that there's an understanding of what I mean when I talk about our emotional intelligence, it is our ability to become aware of that we are feeling emotions. And I have talked about this in previous podcasts, and we'll put the podcast in the show notes, that we previously talked about and defined emotional intelligence. But it's the ability to become aware of our emotions, to be honest about the emotion being present and to honor it rather than to suppress or repress it. Being able to name the emotion accurately, right, with some expanded vocabulary, and having the tools to regulate those emotions in the moment appropriate to the circumstance. And when we can regulate our emotions, we're able to effectively communicate what we need, communicate our boundaries, communicate how we feel. And so I think that this relationship of reconnecting to our emotional intelligence so that we can effectively communicate is very interconnected with the development of emotional maturity. So let's talk about the phases we go through as we're trying to reconnect. And this first phase that we're in, so when we're conditioned out of that emotional intelligence, we are conditioned into a state of emotional bondage. And what that is that we are imprisoned by our emotions. We're in a state of being at the effect, being dragged by our emotions. We feel some way, we act some way. But the mindset is, oh, I can't help it. That's just the way I feel. Or something's happened to me, the emotions happened to me, and I don't have any control. Now, we are human, and so our emotions do arise spontaneously, and we aren't always able to control what arises spontaneously. However, however, we can control once we are aware and we name it what happens next, our response. So when we're in emotional bondage, when we're in that state, when we're in that phase, we are bound. We are bound and imprisoned by that emotion. And it doesn't have to be that way. And what is that looks like advocating responsibility. That looks like not being responsible or accountable for not only the emotions that arise, but the impact that our emotions have when we behave from those emotions, when we are not connecting to our capacity to name and regulate, and even step away and take care of ourselves when we need to. That's like that state of being held by our emotions rather than being able to have the emotion, experience the emotion, name the emotion, and then move in an intentional way. Now, let's be clear, in the remap framework, practicing progress over perfection is probably the one of the most important aspects of the framework, right? So this is not something that comes moving through from emotional bondage or being in that state of emotional bondage. It comes with practice. It comes with recognizing, right? When we recognize that we're being held, like we're being at the effect of our emotions, and we reflect on what is there to do? Like, what do we need to do in that moment? How do we reconnect to our own innate emotional intelligence? What's really going on underneath, right? That emotional awareness. Then we can be flexible and regulate in the moment and be courageous to communicate, right? And begin to model new behavior, right? Acknowledging what's present, being accountable for what's there. So this is moving out of that emotional bondage. Now, what often happens is that when we begin to practice moving out of emotional bondage, like recognizing that our emotions are valid, we actually swing to the opposite side of the pendulum, right? To emotional entitlement. And what that is like, that is that firm stance, like my emotions are valid and I'm going to express them in whatever way I express them. It doesn't matter how it impacts other people. So when we are in emotional bondage, we're like, maybe my emotions are valid. I can't control it. You're in that space of being at the effect of. When we move into entitlement, we are like, I am emotion, hear me roar. Right? And here I am. I am going to express my truth, my feelings, come hell or high water, and I don't care what the impact is on the other person because my emotions matter. Now, again, of course, our emotions are valid, our feelings are valid, what we feel is valid. And feelings are not facts, right? Feelings are just that, they're emotions. They're signals, they're communications that something needs to be addressed. What I think is important is that when we are in this place of emotional entitlement, we lose our sense of the fact that sometimes expressing our emotions in specific ways can be harmful to others. It can activate others' places of harm or their traumas. And sometimes we're expressing from our own places of harm, our wounds, and our trauma. And we're trying to get a footing that find that balance of expression. And so once again, when we recognize that we're operating inside of a state of emotional entitlement, then we can begin to reflect on, okay, where is this coming from? What's not being held? What's not being heard? And what needs to be healed, right? We can ask ourselves that question because oftentimes when we are bulldozing inside of a space of emotional entitlement, that means when I say bulldozing, that means like we're running people over with our feelings without regard or even awareness sometimes of the impact. Usually it's actually from our own place of harm or our own place of not feeling heard. And so when we can recognize when that's happening and reflect on, okay, what's not being heard or held or what needs to be healed, and then we can begin to look in the mirror, right? Have that mirrored back to us, model new behavior, acknowledge, hey, this is what happened. And we can engage in mending or repair so that we can, if there's any harm that's done by that, we can repair that. We can acknowledge what happened. We can be accountable and we can begin to adapt and model something new, right? Again, practicing progress over perfection is key here. This is something that if it is a pattern that has developed, that it takes time to be able to shift, but we must be intentional about that. When we are in our full emotionally intelligent selves, when we are embracing and leaning into that, when we are walking into emotional maturity, this is a space of the third phase, which is emotional liberation, right? This is a space where we can notice when we're feeling something. We can honor that there's something coming up. We may not even have the language for it, but we can name, like, I am in my feelings, something doesn't feel right, and we can regulate appropriately, maybe take a step back, maybe remove ourselves from the room, maybe communicate. Listen, we need to table this conversation so that we can take care of ourselves. So, this is a space of emotional maturity. This is a space of emotional liberation because it doesn't require that we be dragged by our emotions. It doesn't require that we suppress or repress our emotions. It doesn't require that we bulldoze others with our emotions. What it does, it allows us to be with, it allows us to name, to honor ours and others' emotions. It allows us to regulate how we need to regulate. And even if we don't have the language in that moment for what that emotion is, it allows us to step away. Because for some people who are connected kinesthetically to their emotions or connected in that way, they may already know this is what I'm feeling. But for people like me, I'll admit, as a tested introvert, I go inward and I like to reflect. I like to deeply reflect. What was I feeling? And sometimes I need to pull out my emotions wheel and actually get the accurate name and then reflect on what happened, what was underneath. Allowing that space and honoring all of those spaces and to be able to effectively set a boundary or communicate what one's feeling, even if you don't know the exact word, or communicate, hey, I'm feeling this way. I need to pull away and reflect on what's going on. This is a space where we move into emotional liberation, where we're honoring all that's there. And inside of that emotional liberation, we can show up emotionally mature. And so I wanted to just reflect these phases and what that looks like because in on teams, what it shows up in multiple different ways. When we're talking about leaders and teams, this shows up multiple different ways. You could probably think of a way of a time or a person or an incident where someone was experiencing their emotions and they're maybe even expressing it in a way that feels disruptive to what's going on and they're unable to get a hold regulate themselves in that moment and the impact that has around. And we want to be mindful because there's a fine line between invalidating one's emotions and allowing for emotion to be present in space. And there's also a way to acknowledge that, okay, there's an emotion here, and I want to be able to hold that emotion, and I also want to be able to move to the next space. And also, if there's something major that is going on, it may be appropriate to stop the action, especially if there are multiple people experiencing emotions around an event or an environment or something major that's just happened, to create a space for everyone to express in that moment and acknowledge, and then knowing what to do next. What is the next right thing to do? So when we're in organizations and on teams and in meetings and in leadership, I think there's a very important this a very important skill to have. And actually, I spoke with a leader very recently who shared, and actually, I'm going to save some of this because she's going to be on the podcast soon. But she shared when there was something that was going on the team, and there were a lot of emotions involved, but she stopped the action and allowed space for her team to really express what they needed to express. And how, as a leader, her team was so grateful to her for having allowed them to express what they needed to express, for her to express what she needed to express so that they could then move forward feeling heard. So again, this is where emotional maturity and emotional intelligence shows up in leadership and on teams, right? Rather than emotional entitlement, which I'm sure we've seen in the world of leadership, where maybe a leader feels angry and he imposes, and his responses and reactions of my feelings only matter impact the safety and the trust of his teams and his organizations, right? Where that shows up. And so I think it's important to be able to recognize where emotional bondage is showing up, where emotional entitlement is showing up, and how we move into the emotional liberation space, not only in our personal lives. I sure am working on breaking generational patterns. And so this is something that shows up on a regular basis in my relationship with my son, in my relationship with my sisters, in my relationship with my co-parent. Like, how do I show up as an emotionally mature person in each of these contexts? But also in the organization and on teams, we can recognize where these three phases are showing up and impacting performance, impacting trust, impacting safety, impacting mental and emotional well-being. So I invite you to begin to notice these three spaces of emotional bondage, emotional entitlement, and emotional liberation, because we must acknowledge where that is showing up, where emotional maturity is actually showing up on our teams, because then we can mirror and model that and replicate that. This is why I take organizations, this is why I work with cohorts of leaders, moving them through my communication, the remap communication that transforms course inside of a coaching cohort, because it is so valuable to be among colleagues doing this process. So I invite you to look at, where is this showing up? Where is this showing up in your home, but where is this also showing up in your organizations, your teams, and in leadership? And look at how can you begin to look at the remap framework and move and start to think about how this can help move your team towards emotional maturity so that you create deeper trust, deeper safety, improved creativity, more innovation, and forward movement and productivity in your teams and organizations, and quite frankly, in your household, in your communities as well. All right? Save this episode because you can come back to it. You might want to share this. You might want to share this episode with a colleague, with a team member, with a family member, with your community, because this type of information is the information that is going to move us forward in connection, in community with one another, and restore that trust and restore that safety. All right. By now, you all know that I have another TEDx talk coming up. And at the time of this recording, it's only 3 weeks away. So by the time this episode is released, it may have just happened. So stay tuned, because I will be sharing what we're going to be doing to cultivate conversation around what I'm going to be talking about, which is relationship repair. We're going to cultivate, we're going to do some events coming up once the TEDx is released, once the video is released. I'm going to really cultivate some conversation to really help move people forward and to begin to take the tools. Stay tuned for that information. It's coming up. And in the meantime, leave a review. If you're listening to me on YouTube, please leave a comment. Let us know what you think of this episode. If you're on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, any of the other podcast platforms, and you're listening, please leave a review for us and letting others know that this is valuable content. These are valuable learnings. And it also helps to serve the podcast up even more for our listeners. All right. Have an amazing week. Start to notice the spaces that you're in emotionally. Start to notice around you how others are showing up so you can identify and pass this message along. Until the next time I see you, stay empowered.